In the caves of Pech Merle, deep in the limestone heart of France, archaeologists discovered something that shouldn't exist: handprints pressed against stone 40,000 years ago, their edges wavering like leaves in an invisible wind. The red ochre traces a story of trembling fingers, of palms that shook as they reached toward eternity. These weren't the steady marks of confident artists decorating their sacred spaces. They were the desperate signatures of minds coming undone. Dr. Marie Ceresi first noticed the pattern in 2018, studying the microscopic variations in Paleolithic cave art, where other researchers saw natural irregularities. She recognized something far more troubling. The wavering lines matched the motor tremors of neurological degeneration. Someone had painted these walls while their brain was slowly dissolving. In the Vindija Cave of Croatia, a Neanderthal skeleton tells an even darker story. The 40,000-year-old remains show clear signs of spongiform and brain tissue eaten full of holes like a sponge. The skull bears lesions consistent with what we now call Creutzfeldt-Jakobi disease. But this wasn't modern medical terminology that could explain the horror. This was a human being whose mind became a stranger to itself, surrounded by family who watched helplessly as their loved one disappeared from within. The evidence whispers from a dozen archaeological sites across Europe and Asia. Tools abandoned mid-creation, their edges unfinished, as if the makers simply forgot what they were doing. Bone needles carved with increasingly erratic patterns, the final attempts growing wild and meaningless. Stone scrapers left scattered around hearths, their makers no longer remembering their purpose. At Gough's cave in England, human remains show the unmistakable signs of both ritual processing and neurological disease. The bones were carefully cracked to extract marrow, but some bear the telltale pitting of prion infection. These weren't just bodies being prepared for burial or consumption. They were the physical evidence of a microscopic killer that turned families into unwitting accomplices in their own destruction. What happens when the very organ that makes us human, our capacity for memory, recognition, love, turns against us? How did our ancestors face madness when they had no words for neurons, no concept of proteins folding incorrectly in the darkness of their skulls? The trembling hand pressed against cave stone becomes a message across 40 millennia. It says, "I was here. I was human. And something terrible was happening to me that I could not understand." When the mind becomes stranger, the killer was smaller than anything they could imagine. A misfolded protein that spread like whispered rumors through nervous tissue. Prions are not alive in any sense we understand, yet they consume living minds with methodical precision. They transform healthy brain proteins into twisted versions of themselves, creating cascading waves of cellular death. The brain becomes Swiss cheese, riddled with holes where memories and motor control once lived. But 40,000 years ago, there were no microscopes to reveal this molecular horror. There were only symptoms that arrived like curses, the gradual loss of everything that made a person recognizable to themselves. At Gough's cave, the evidence tells a story of communities unknowingly feeding the very disease that stalked them. Funeral cannibalism was not savagery, it was love transformed into tragedy. When a respected elder died, their brain tissue was consumed as a way of keeping their wisdom within the tribe. The practice honored the dead while inadvertently spreading their neurological doom to the living. The disease would have announced itself subtly at first. A master toolmaker begins to fumble with knapping techniques they've perfected over decades. A storyteller forgets the middle of tales that once flowed like rivers from their memory. A tracker loses the ability to read signs in the forest that were once as clear as spoken words. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing cremation practices in certain regions. Perhaps some groups began to suspect that something in the bodies of the dead carried forward into the living. The careful disposal of brain tissue becomes more common in burial sites. Funeral practices grow more complex, as if communities were trying to build barriers against invisible threats. But the worst part wasn't the physical symptoms. It was watching someone's personality dissolve like salt in water. The gentle parent becomes violent and unpredictable. The wise leader begins to see threats that don't exist. The loving partner no longer recognizes the face they've woken beside for 20 years. In small bands of 20 or 30 people, where survival depended on intimate cooperation, this was catastrophic. When the keeper of fire-making techniques forgets how to create flame, the entire group faces death. When the healer begins to confuse beneficial plants with poisonous ones, trust in traditional knowledge crumbles. When the scout, who knows every game trail, starts wandering in circles, winter becomes a sentence of starvation. The Vindija Cave skeleton shows evidence of care, extending months beyond the onset of symptoms. Tooth-wear patterns indicate this individual was fed soft foods long after they could no longer chew effectively. Their bones show no signs of neglect or abandonment. Someone continued to care for them even as their mind became an uninhabitable place. This wasn't just medical management, it was an act of profound faith in the persistence of human worth beyond cognitive function. The disease stripped away language, memory, and recognition, but it couldn't destroy the bonds that held communities together. Even when faces became unrecognizable and names dissolved into meaningless sounds, love found ways to endure. The unraveling of everything known. Imagine waking up one morning and not recognizing your own child's face. Their features seem strange, threatening, as if a changeling has replaced the person you loved most. This wasn't metaphor for our ancestors. It was Tuesday. Prion disease doesn't just steal memories. It rewrites the fundamental software of recognition and emotion. The archaeological evidence from multiple Paleolithic sites suggests entire communities grappling with this cognitive apocalypse. At Queba, the Los Sabiones in spine burial practices suddenly shift around 35,000 years ago. Bodies begin to be interred with their hands bound, as if the living feared the dead might rise and wander. Brain tissue is systematically removed before burial, disposed of in ways that suggest growing awareness of contamination. The change happens too quickly and too universally to be coincidence. Something was teaching these groups to fear the minds of their own dead. When a disease attacks the brain, it doesn't just affect the individual, it attacks the entire social fabric. In communities where knowledge passed through oral tradition, the loss of experienced minds was culturally catastrophic. The woman who knew which berries were safe to eat begins to confuse them with deadly varieties. The hunter who could read weather patterns starts making decisions that lead groups into deadly storms. The elder who held the stories of ancestral migrations forgets, not just the tales, but the very concept of storytelling itself. Families would have watched helplessly as their loved ones transformed into strangers wearing familiar bodies. The kind grandfather becomes paranoid and aggressive. The nurturing mother starts to see her own children as threats. The steady provider begins hoarding resources and attacking anyone who approaches. But perhaps most terrifying was the way the disease attacked the foundation of human identity, the sense of continuous self. Victims wouldn't just forget recent events, they would lose the thread that connected past to present. Each moment became isolated, disconnected from the story of their own life. They might recognize a face one hour and see a dangerous stranger the next. Archaeological evidence suggests some groups developed new social structures in response to this threat. Burial sites show increased emphasis on community rather than individual grave goods. Tool-making techniques become more standardized, as if knowledge was being distributed across more people to prevent total loss. Cave art from this period shows recurring themes of handprints and group activities, possibly documenting the importance of collective memory. Some communities appear to have split into smaller groups, perhaps recognizing that isolation could prevent the spread of whatever was stealing their minds. But fragmentation came with its own costs. Smaller groups were more vulnerable to environmental threats and had less genetic diversity. The disease forced impossible choices between safety and survival. Trust became a luxury these communities could barely afford. When you can't be certain that the person sharing your fire tonight will recognize you tomorrow morning, social bonds become both more precious and more fragile. Yet somehow, they endured. The archaeological record shows continuous occupation, ongoing innovation, persistent care for the vulnerable. Even as minds crumbled around them, these humans found ways to maintain their humanity. What we've forgotten about forgetting. We live in an age where forgetting has become optional. External hard drives store our memories, GPS replaces our sense of direction, and search engines eliminate the need to hold facts in our minds. But our ancestors lived with the constant awareness that memory was fragile, precious, and absolutely essential for survival. They understood something we've lost, that the mind is not a possession, but a responsibility. Modern medicine allows us to hide cognitive decline behind institutional walls and pharmaceutical management. We've created a society where those losing their minds disappear from daily life, becoming invisible until their families can no longer cope. But Paleolithic communities had no such luxury of separation. When someone's mind began to unravel, the entire group had to adapt, accommodate, and continue loving them through their transformation. The Vindija Cave excavations revealed a Neanderthal who lived for years with severe cognitive impairment. Dental evidence shows this individual was fed by others long after they could feed themselves. Their bones show no signs of violence or neglect, despite being completely dependent on group care. This wasn't unusual, it was typical. Our ancestors seem to have understood intuitively that humanity isn't measured by cognitive capacity or productive contribution. They cared for their impaired members not because it made economic sense, but because abandoning the vulnerable would have meant abandoning their own humanity. Today, we medicalize conditions that our ancestors saw as part of the human experience. Depression becomes a chemical imbalance to be corrected rather than a natural response to loss and limitation. Anxiety transforms from adaptive caution into pathological disorder, requiring pharmaceutical intervention. We've gained the ability to treat symptoms, but lost the wisdom to live with uncertainty and imperfection. Our prehistoric ancestors faced terrors we can barely imagine: diseases that stole minds, winters that lasted years, predators that hunted humans. Yet archaeological evidence suggests they maintained remarkably stable communities across millennia. Their secret wasn't advanced technology or medical knowledge, it was an understanding that human worth transcends individual capability. They created social structures that could absorb the loss of key individuals without collapse. Knowledge was distributed, care was communal, and identity was collective rather than purely individual. When someone lost their memory, the community became their memory. When hands began to tremble, others guided them. When recognition failed, love persisted without requiring reciprocal acknowledgement. Perhaps most importantly, they lived with the daily awareness that cognitive function was a gift, not a guarantee. Every clear thought, every steady hand, every moment of recognition was precious because they knew how quickly it could disappear. This awareness didn't paralyze them with fear. It filled them with gratitude for the present moment. We've conquered many of the diseases that terrorized our ancestors, but we've also lost their intimate relationship with mental fragility. We expect our minds to work perfectly and panic when they don't. They expected their minds to be temporary vessels and found peace in the persistence of love. The most profound archaeological discovery isn't a tool or artwork. It's evidence of care that continued long after it made practical sense. At Dmanisi in Georgia, researchers found the remains of an elderly hominid who lived years beyond the onset of severe neurological degeneration. This individual had lost most of their teeth, suffered from significant cognitive impairment, and could barely walk. Yet they were fed, protected, and kept warm by their community until natural death claimed them. This wasn't an isolated case of exceptional compassion. It appears to have been the norm. Site after site reveals evidence of long-term care for individuals who could contribute nothing to group survival except their simple presence. The blind were guided, the lame were carried, the confused were patiently redirected. These weren't acts of charity, they were expressions of a fundamental understanding about what makes us human. When prion disease attacked the Paleolithic mind, it stripped away language, memory, and recognition. Victims lost the ability to remember their children's names, recognize their lifelong partners, or understand their place in the world. But their communities didn't lose the ability to love them. Archaeological evidence suggests that care for the cognitively impaired actually intensified during the final phases of illness. Bodies show evidence of meticulous cleaning, careful feeding, and positioning to prevent beds. These were people who no longer knew their own names being tended by others who would never be thanked or remembered for their service. The Vindija Cave skeleton tells this story in microscopic detail. Bone analysis reveals this individual received consistent nutrition. Despite being unable to feed themselves, their remains show no evidence of violence, neglect, or premature death. Someone chose to maintain this person's dignity even as their mind dissolved. What does this teach us about the nature of love itself? Perhaps our ancestors understood that love isn't a transaction requiring reciprocal recognition. It's a commitment that persists, even when the beloved becomes a stranger. When everything that we think defines a person, their memories, personality, abilities, can be stripped away by microscopic proteins, what remains? Our ancestors discovered the answer through the worst possible circumstances. What remains is the choice to stay present with another human being. This choice transcends utility, recognition, or reward. It's based on something deeper than individual identity, the recognition that humanity itself lives in the spaces between us. Today, we struggle with caring for those whose minds have become foreign countries. Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and psychiatric illness challenge our understanding of personal identity, just as prion disease challenged our ancestors. But we've forgotten something they knew instinctively, that the person we love continues to exist even when they can no longer demonstrate their presence in familiar ways. The archaeological record suggests that communities which maintained care for their cognitively impaired members were more resilient and stable over long periods. This wasn't despite their burden of dependent members, it was because of their commitment to unconditional care. Groups that prioritized only the productive and capable were more likely to fragment when facing environmental stress. Those that maintained broad networks of mutual support survived repeated crises across millennia. Perhaps the greatest lesson from these ancient people isn't about disease or survival. It's about the persistence of love in impossible circumstances. They faced horrors we can barely imagine with tools we would consider primitive, yet they chose to remain with their loved ones as minds disappeared, to continue caring when care would never be reciprocated, to maintain dignity for those who could no longer maintain it themselves. In a world increasingly defined by individual achievement and cognitive capacity, there's profound wisdom in their example. They discovered that humanity isn't located in the mind but in the commitment to stay present with each other through every form of brokenness. The trembling hand pressed against cave stone 40,000 years ago carries a message we're still learning to read: that love persists beyond recognition. Care transcends understanding, and the deepest human truths emerge not in moments of strength, but in our willingness to remain tender toward what we cannot fix.